Shalom and welcome. I'm Jeremy Lisitza, Director of Innovation and Volunteer Engagement at the Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee. Thank you for joining this club-fed journey of World Heritage Sites in Israel with Dr. Stephen Derfler. The Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee's mission is to strengthen Jewish life and identity in our community, provide for Jewish people in need, and promote support for Israel. Therefore, we are thrilled to provide our community with new and innovative programming virtually, especially in a time of such uncertainty. Dr. Derfler is an educational consultant, archaeologist, historian, researcher, teacher, and writer. Dr. Derfler has been uncovering the histories of ancient civilizations for over 45 years. The lecture will run about 45 to 50 minutes with a Q&A following. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions. And finally, I hope you will join me for a new Federation outreach program that you will want to participate in called Just Schmoozing. For more information, please feel free to email me and I will get you registered. It starts tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Derfler. Thank you.
Hi guys, all 55, 56 of you.
Hello.
Before we get going, I just want to remind you that if you haven't been muted, please mute yourself so that we don't hear you eating potato chips or pretzels. But if you're eating soft food and it's silent, no, I'm just kidding, just kidding. So now we're into our third week of World Heritage Sites. And we're going to share the screen just like this. And are we all good?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, we can. Okay. We're going to be looking at Mount Carmel. We're going to be looking at Beit Shearim, and we're going to be looking at the old city of Jerusalem today. So we're going to go way back in time to begin everything now today. Number 4, the prehistoric caves along the slopes of Mount Carmel, which forms the backbone of the modern city of Haifa and anchors the southern end of the plain of Akko, with this limestone cliff plunging directly into the Mediterranean at Haifa and thus isolating the plain of Akko from the rest of Israel's coastline. The caves are primarily located along the western slope of Mount Carmel, and they're about 20 kilometers south of the core of the city. It's known as Nachal Me'erot, the Valley of the Caves, and this is overlooking then the rest of the southern coastal zone, which includes the Sharon Plain running further to the south. These caves have been known to humankind for hundreds of years, but wouldn't be explored until the 1920s and the 1930s. Then, following the creation of the State of Israel, in the mid-1960s, the University of Michigan would team up along with Tel Aviv University and also the Antiquities Authority of Israel to carry on further excavations. And these modern scientific methods would allow us to understand some of the earliest origins of humankind and begin the new wave of archaeological research. That new wave of research isn't just digging and looking at artifactual evidence, but it's also looking at geology, geography, paleontology, palinography, the works when it comes to the range, metallurgy, the human experience. So we would have the study of the pollen, study of the fossils, study of everything in these caves that relates to the evolution of the human experience.
Okay.
These World Heritage Sites would then be identified, nominated and accepted into the World Heritage Organization just in 2012. Here you can see some of the main caves that today are also part of the National Parks Authority, meaning that there is easier access. When the caves were first opened up to tourists, it was very difficult. You can possibly then imagine Masada before the cable car. That's the kind of situation that we were looking at until after these caves became World Heritage Sites. You can see the Nahal Me'erot in the lower right-hand picture, which is the valley. And then in the upper picture, you can see a staircase with railings that has been created since the World Heritage Organization became a part of the Carmel Caves. There are quite a number of caves that are part of this Paleolithic Age World Heritage Site. You have got the caves called Tubulin Cave, El Wad, Jamal, and School Caves. And if you notice, these are all Arabic names for these caves. Based on carbon-14 and thermal luminescence in terms of dating, the ranges are anywhere from 100,000 years ago to 45,000 years ago. So it's at the dawn of the human experience in the ancient Near East. And here you can see the location of these caves along the western slope of Mount Carmel that you can see right here, with a couple of caves further afar on the eastern slope, such as Kafzeh and Amud Pillar. The Tubulin Cave is the main cave, and since I've been fortunate enough to have been going to Israel since the late 60s and the early 70s, I've seen some of these caves before the addition of the walkways and the railings, etc. And that's what you see in the right-hand pictures. These caves, especially the two entrances that you see for Tubulin Cave, date to what we call the lower and middle Paleolithic ages, anywhere from 400,000 or so down to 40,000 years ago. Inside these caves, there's 25 meters of occupational debris that is accumulated. Can you imagine that? That's 75, 76 feet worth of human occupation built up over time in these caves. And some of the earliest deposits have levels of sea sand found in them. What does this mean? It means that the level of the Mediterranean was much higher in antiquity, and that the lower extremities of Tubulin Cave regularly would find that high tide would wash sand and silt into these. The sea levels rose because the glaciers were melting. So they were about 100 meters, 300 feet higher, the Mediterranean, than what we have today. That's an incredible amount of water. Here you can see some of the work that had been done in the early 1970s by the University of Michigan teams. And you can see that on the outer ledge and the approach to Tubulin Cave, you can see the gentleman on the left taking geological core samples from each of the strata. In the right-hand pictures, you can see just some of the scores of lenses or occupational levels that were found of human occupation within the caves. Now remember, we all may be used to the major archaeological sites like Megiddo, like Metzada, like Beersheba, Hatzor, that have a lot of occupational debris as a deep earth site, but then they have buildings that mean that some of the occupational levels can be anywhere from 10 inches up to 3 or 4 feet in depth. In antiquity, when we talk about the prehistoric world in the Paleolithic Age, we're talking about occupation levels that can only be sometimes quarter of an inch thick until the next phase. So there have been over 50 occupational levels found within the caves, ranging over these periods of tens of thousands of years. And if you look very carefully in the upper right-hand picture, if you notice there are a whole bunch of tags right there, little white tags. Each one of those is an occupation level. Each one of those, to make it easier, let's imagine this. You're remodeling your kitchen and you strip out the tile floor and you've got the concrete. Then you put another tile floor on that, or then you decide that you don't want a tile floor later and you put down hardwood. Or you don't like that and you finally put down carpeting. The whole thing may only be an inch thick, but it's 3 occupation levels based on all of those layers of flooring that you put down. That's the same kind of thing that we're looking at here in Tubulin Cave. How do we date some of these lenses or levels? Well, one of the primary ways of dating is through the use of carbon-14, radioactive carbon. Now, carbon molecules, when you bombard them with a radioactive isotope, they turn into carbon-14. Carbon-14 is an entirely different kind of material. It has something that we call a half-life. And a half-life is something that says that this carbon-14 material will disintegrate at a certain rate. So at some time in the future, there won't be any of it left, as a hypothetical. Carbon-14 has a rough half-life of about 5,250 years, which means that if you have a gram of carbon-14 and you sit around and watch it for 5,250 years, well, okay, for one thing, you're an optimist. And the other, then you only have half of a gram of carbon-14 left. This is great for tens of thousands of years ago because it has a range, a plus or minus, of about 250 years. So when you're talking about 40,000 years ago, a range of plus or minus 250 years is really nothing. So we can use that to help us to date these strata or these lenses or these occupation levels. Another way that we also use to identify these levels is through the evolution of the human experience through the creation of Flint tools. And these tools all are proprietary when it comes to shape and design, and they show us an evolution in technology and in techniques, such as you see here in the left and lower pictures. These primary Flint tools are usually 1 or 2 different periods of flaking to make a sharper and sharper edge to them. And these can all be dated according to different geologic occupational eras in these caves. These tools date, for example, to around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, based on the technique and the shape of the tools. A second cave that would be excavated and cleared is called the School Cave, S-K-H-U-L. This is called the Cave of Kids, and it refers to baby goats. A number of human burials have been discovered in the excavation of this cave. There is no large outer plateau or plaza area in front of the cave. So rather, most of the excavations carried out by the University of Michigan and Tel Aviv University are all deep in the interior of this cave. You can see the cave opening on the right. There you can see excavations that have been carried out These excavations dated to the mid-70s to the end of the 1970s. You can see the wooden boardwalks that were placed down by the archaeologists so that you would have easy passage within the caves, and you can see that they would be forced to use artificial light so they could actually see what they were doing. If you look in the lower left-hand picture, in the upper portion, you can see the modern floor level of this cave. And you can see the entrance to the cave and the natural light then that is filtering into the cave. You can see how the archaeologists have dug down in this particular photograph on the left, over 7 feet already, and have recognized a number of floor levels as they keep to descend further and further down. They would find 14 skeletons inside this cave. 3 of them were complete, and the others were all fragmentary remains. There would be 1, 2, 3, maybe a handful of bones, but the osteologists, these bone experts, were able to ascertain that there were 14 different skeletons amongst all of the bones. And these people are really good at what they do. They could even begin to decide the possible ages of death of some of these skeletons as well. Here you can see some of the many bone fragments in the center picture, and many of the fragments you can see in the lower right. These were some of the earliest evidence of what we would call the human experience. And they were called the earliest example of Homo sapiens. And they were very close to us in terms of their physical experience. They had delicate facial features, a slightly protruding chin, a straight forehead. And this all took place roughly 100,000 years ago. Here you can see one of the skulls that has been partially reconstructed by the forensic archaeologists to give us a better idea of the skeletal structure that's just about 100,000 years ago. The Cave of the Valley, or in Arabic, El Wad, the Wadi, is the largest of the Carmel caves. And this shows us that this cave was a recent addition, only about 45,000 years ago. Apparently, if you remember that HGTV show, Cave Hunters instead of House Hunters. All right, Jeremy, that was bad. My apologies. The Tubulin Cave seems to have fallen out of use, and the residents of the Carmel slopes seem to move to this cave just a couple of kilometers away and abandoned the Tubulin Cave. But it would be in use for well over 40,000 years. And the most substantial remains to be found and excavated are what are part of the Natufian culture, just about 12,000 years ago, or around 10,500 BCE. And it signals an important era for us in the history of the human experience. This is the transition when humans began to move from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals. We call this the Neolithic Age or the New Stone Age. And it's at this time that humankind makes a quantum leap. No longer are you chasing your food sources and living in temporary shelters as you followed the food, but rather now you could begin to live in more permanent places, build structures, settle down, because you could grow your food and domesticate animals and you wouldn't have to chase after them. Humans then developed a better source of food, a more nutritious sort of food, and this would allow humans to further evolutionize physically, becoming more robust, but then also allowing for the creation of culture as they settle down and the communities grow exponentially in numbers. Here you can see work that was carried out in the 1990s, and you can see that the caves even had some kind of a covering over the entrances to protect the archaeologists from the sun and from wind, and protect the archaeological site as they would dig deeper. There was a terrace found in front of El Wad Cave, and this is where they would discover over what they considered 100 individual humans to be buried. And when we say that, again, remember, we're talking about perhaps 2 or 3 bones of a particular individual found in the debris, and only a few complete skeletons were discovered. The average height of people just about 12,000 years ago was about 1.5 meters, or we're talking about 5'2", perhaps 5'2" or 5'3". And they seem to be direct ancestors of what we call the Mediterranean individuals that we see today, rimming the Mediterranean from Greece all the way around Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and northern Sinai. One of the excavations discovered was fairly interesting, and the archaeologists dubbed them Romeo and Juliet. Why? Because it was a dual burial. And you can see it excavated in the lower left, but then an artist's reconstruction shows you the placement of the man and the woman inside of that burial pit. They were simple, plain cyst graves or burials. There was no lining to them, no stone lining, no brick lining, and they were all in the flexed position or the fetal position, as you can see here, with their legs tucked up. Fascinating stuff. And I had to throw that in. So, from there, we're also along the slopes of Mount Carmel, and we're coming to a place known as Beit Shearim. And if you look at it carefully, that's number 15 on the plan. This is one of the most recent sites in Israel to be nominated and approved by the World Heritage Organization, dated to 2015. And it's extraordinarily important to us in terms of the evolution of modern Judaism out of its ancient Israelite roots. The necropolis can be found here, located though along the eastern slope of Mount Carmel, overlooking the Jezreel Valley, again, not too far away to the southeast of Haifa. But notice, it took a decade, a dozen years, for it to finally be approved by UNESCO, because it was nominated by Israel in 2012. There you can see the site of Beit Shearim and the catacombs that we're going to focus in on, and then to the upper right of the picture, at the beginning of the area of the Jezreel Valley. Now, if you look at the site of Beit Shearim, it is a fascinating burial complex. It is an entire necropolis or burial city carved out of the living bedrock of Mount Carmel. These are passages and loculi, burial chambers that run well over a mile in a number of different passages that all run off one another inside the mountain itself. it seems that it was in use for well over 200 years. You've got sarcophagi that are incised and painted with inscriptions telling us who was buried where, and they're written in Hebrew, Aramaic, which is the lingua franca of the biblical world, if you consider that Hebrew was the language of faith. And the similarity, which I'm sure that most of you know, is the difference between the Queen's English in England and our English. If you know Aramaic, you know Hebrew. If you know Hebrew, you know Aramaic. It's just adding the U in armor or color, so to speak. Palmyrene is an offshoot, a combination of Aramaic and Greek, and then you have Greek as well. And many people consider this to be the most extensive Jewish cemetery in the world, at least in terms of antiquity. The site was originally excavated by one of the giants of the Palestinian Jewish School of Archaeology. And that giant would be Benjamin Mazar. His younger colleague in the next generation, a student of his, was Nachman Avigad. Remember, in 1929, the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus was opened, and Benjamin Mazar, along with Eliezer Lipa-Sukenik, the father of Yigil Yadin, would be the first chairs of the department. But there was no state of Israel. So this was a Palestinian Jewish endeavor. The site would be identified as Beit Shearim because they found a tablet that was incised in ancient Greek with the word Besara, which is the Greek name for Beit Shearim. The catacombs themselves show us that in the latter decades of use of the cemetery, they ran out of space. And they ran out of, I guess, good stonemasons to create additional chambers and additional loculi or burial niches, because you find scores of stone sarcophagi lining the passages, as you can see here in the two pictures on the upper right and the lower left. This catacomb was called by Benjamin Mazar Catacomb 20, or the Cave of the Coffins, because of the number of sarcophagi that were found lining the passages. And if there was any doubt as to whether this was a Jewish burial complex, the objects that would be found carved into or painted on not just the sarcophagi, but the walls of the chambers themselves would put that to rest, because you have menorot, you have the lions of Judah, you have the Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions as well. The most important burial complex was this one, number 20. The central corridor runs over 50 meters in length, and there were numerous smaller branches running off to the sides. You have limestone sarcophagi, and you've got marble sarcophagi that were the more expensive ones, obviously. As you can see in the lower right, there you can see two lions that were beautifully carved in raised relief on one of the limestone sarcophagi. Other images show us bullheads, eagles, etc. In 37, there were a series of catacombs that were discovered to, believe it or not, the Jews of Himyar. And Himyar is ancient Yemen, along the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. This is incredible. This is just way cool to think that Jews of the 3rd century of this era, 1700 years ago, traveled from the Arabian Peninsula, that there were even Jews in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula who came back to Judea and to Palestine to live. And here you can see the entrance to one of the burial chambers. You can see an individual holding above his head, perhaps, a menorah, not a Chanukiah, because there are only 7 branches to that candelabra. And then below, in beautiful Greek letters, it says, the tomb of the Themariite. In other words, tomb of a family from Yemen. Beit Shearim became a major center for the Sanhedrin, the legal court of the Jewish community in the end of the 1st century and the 1st century of this era as well. It is here that you find the Jewish community's legal court moving following the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. And it would be the rabbi, Yehuda Navi, Judah the prince, who brought about this period of renewal in the 2nd century. When he died, he would be buried in Beit Shearim. But then, as is the case with the rabbinic community and disciples of rabbis, whenever one of his followers would die, they wanted to be buried near him as well, because they felt that it gave them a sense of holiness and closeness to their Rebbe. And so there are over 30 burials of rabbis who, according to documentation, were disciples or students of Yehuda Nasi. This is the cave complex number 14, and it probably belonged to his family, according to the inscriptions. In addition, you find inscriptions that mention Shimon, Gamliel, and Hananiah, who were all students of Judah the prince, Yehuda Nasi. And one of the inscriptions says, Simon, my son, shall be Chacham, the president of the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel, my son, the patriarch, and Hananiah bar Yechama shall preside over the great court. This was a who's who of rabbinic leadership of the 2nd and early 3rd centuries of this era. Now, we don't have any inscriptions, but it is assumed that these 2 graves that you find in the central chamber of number 14 belong to Yehuda and his wife. Some of the Jewish symbols to be found in many of these catacombs, you can see here. Columns representing Yakin and Boaz, the 2 pillars that stood outside Herod's temple in Jerusalem. You can see another menorah, and then you can see the loculi, the burial niches where individuals would be buried. And in the lower picture, if you take a look at that, what's that look like? Well, to me, it looks like a lulav. You know, in terms of Sukkot, the lulav and the etrog, beautifully carved on the wall of this tomb catacomb. And you can see some of the names and some of the inscriptions. In translation, this is the coffin of Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Levi, who made this cave. Or this is the coffin of Kira Mega, the wife of Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi, Shalom. And again, the cave of the Lulavim on the lower right. But to show you how the Jewish community was integrated into the Greco-Roman world, here you can see, beautifully painted in Greek, the tomb of Idesios, head of the Council of Elders from Antiochia. In other words, from southeastern Syria, Antioch, or here in Aramaic. Shimon, son of Yochanan, whoever shall open upon him shall die of an unfortunate end. In other words, don't desecrate the tombs. And finally, a sad one. Here they lie, Atio, the daughter of Rav Gamliel ben Nehemiah, who died a virgin at the age of 22, and Ation, the daughter of Rabbi Yehuda ben Rav Gamliel, that dies at the age of 9 and 6 months. And now we move south to Dakar Jerusalem, the old city. Now, Jerusalem is one of the oldest UNESCO sites in this part of the world, dated to 1981. But think of this, guys. In 1980, the old city and many of the Islamic holy places were still under the control of the Waqf, which then was part and parcel of the Jordanian previous control of the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem. Now, before the Jordanians and King Hussein ceded control of the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority, they wanted to show that they still had a modicum of authority over this part of the world, even though Jerusalem had been reunited in 1967. So the Jordanians nominated the old city and the old city walls to UNESCO, and then UNESCO would vote on it and add it to the list in 1981. I'm going to step out of the box for a second and make a statement. But notice, remember the other site, Beit Shearim, that we saw took 12 years after nomination to be approved? Well, is this, I'm just saying, is this a UNESCO statement showing that Israel was, and its occupation and annexation and reunification of the eastern side of the city and the old city was politicized, and that UNESCO was making a statement by approving it by Jordanians within a year, not taking 12 years. Okay, I'm back in the box. The current walls of the old city were constructed by this guy, Suleiman the Magnificent, and it took just a handful of years, finished around 1538. The footprint of the old city was unchanged from that of the Crusaders, which was about 5 centuries earlier. And this building inscription was discovered during excavations in the old city that commemorates the renewal of the city walls. He has decreed the construction of the wall. He has protected the home of Islam with his might and main, and wiped out the tyranny of idols with his power and strength. He whom alone God is enabled to enslave the necks of kings and countries far and wide, and deservedly acquire the throne of the Caliphate, the Sultan, son of the Sultan, son of the Sultan, son of the Sultan, Suleiman. Do you think that he was a member of the Sultan family? This was the inscription, the dedicatory inscription. Now, here's something interesting. According to tradition, there was a great feast that was held in honor of the 2 architects who designed and built the city walls and the gates. At the end of this party, in their honor, according to tradition, Suleiman had them beheaded. What? Why? Because, almost all of you have been to Israel, have been to the old city. And you know that Mount Zion, the traditional burial place of King David, who is considered to be a prophet and considered to be a major figure for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, David was buried on top of Mount Zion. The 2 engineers did not include Mount Zion in the city walls. You know, you walk out the Zion Gate and then you go over to Mount Zion. Well, this was a no-no. This was an insult to Suleiman the Magnificent, and he ordered them killed. But he gave them a place of honor. And if any of you have gone into the old city through the Jaffa Gate, 25 feet inside the Jaffa Gate, in this little bitty garden, which many of you probably missed because your tour guides don't show it to you, you have two graves. And you can see these two graves have on them the turban that's representative of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. These are the two architects buried just inside Jaffa Gate. The old city is divided up into 4 different quarters, and they're all separated internally, one from another. There were 2 sets of gates that isolated each of these quarters at night. One that you locked, and then the one on the other side that they locked, so there was mutual separation and security. You've got the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and then the Armenians got their own quarter. Go figure, right? There are 43 towers. There are 11 gates. 7 of them are currently open, and the walls run 4.5 kilometers in length. Today, ranging in height anywhere from 5 to 15 meters and averaging 9 or 10 feet in thickness. And we're going to take a spin around this old city. And we start out with the Jaffa Gate. And it's the only gate that was positioned at a right angle to the city wall. And this was a defensive measure. Why was this called the Jaffa Gate? Why are the other gates named in their ways as well, some of them? It's because there wasn't I-75 in the biblical world. The roads were called the way to or the way from. And as a result, the Jaffa Gate was situated at the terminus of the road from Jaffa. So Jaffa Road ran directly to the Jaffa Gate. But the current gate that we're familiar with, for the most part, isn't an ancient gate at all. It's a modern gate that dates only to World War I. And that's because of General Allenby. When Jerusalem was captured from the Turks, Allenby wanted to walk into the city in triumph, but he also wanted to do it on foot as a matter of respect. But then he also wanted to be followed by his armored vehicles and cars and convoys. So what did he do? He blasted a hole in the city wall adjacent to the gate. And today, that's what many people mistakenly call the Jaffa Gate, where it's just a hole because it would be opened, broadened, so that you could have vehicular traffic entering into the old city, as you see on the lower right. There's the actual gate on the lower left, right here. And then the portion of wall that was blown apart and removed is this portion, if you see where my arrow is going, right there. The Jaffa Gate is protected by what is known as the Citadel. The Citadel is one of those defensive towers, but it is not what we call the Citadel colloquially today. The Citadel colloquially actually should be referred to as the area of the Tower of David, which has nothing to do with King David. The tower, as you can see in the upper left, is a minaret of a mosque that dates to the 15th century. It's located inside the Western Palace Fortress of King Herod. But the tower that protects and dominates the Jaffa Gate, you can see in the upper right-hand picture, the lower foundations date to King Herod, and the upper portion dates to the Crusaders, and then would be reused by the Ottoman Turks. On the lower left, I had to throw this in. I was in Jerusalem, I don't know, a couple of decades ago in January, and it snowed. And there was a whopping 4 inches of snow on the ground. All that white stuff that you see there, that is the Citadel, known as Migdal David. As you can see the sign there, the Tower of David, in the midst of a snowfall. On the lower right is the plaza that is immediately inside of the Jaffa Gate. And now you can see very clearly on the left, the blown open portion for vehicular traffic, the actual gate on the right, and on the horizon in the background is the King David Hotel with the tower of the Western YMCA in the background. We're working our way clockwise, and we find that one of the newest gates to be opened only dates to 1889. In Arabic, called Bab el-Jadid, or in Hebrew, Shar HaChadash, the new gate. And it was a direct opening and access into the Christian quarter, which previously had not existed. You could only enter the Christian quarter from the north into the border between the Muslim quarter and the Christian quarter through the Damascus Gate, or from the south through the Armenian quarter, Christian quarter border to get into the Christian quarter. But now in 1889, they had their own gate. This is the inside of the gate, and you can see it's a small postern style gate. It's the highest point of the old city, and it's 790 meters above sea level. From there, we move to the Damascus Gate. Now, in Hebrew, it's called Shar Shechem. Why? Because the road from the ancient capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, 2,700 years ago, Shechem, terminated here. So in Hebrew, it's called Shar Shechem. But in terms of the modern name, it's called the Damascus Gate because Shechem no longer really exists. And the major city that the road continued on to was the capital of Syria, Damascus. But in Arabic, it's called Bab el-Amud, the gate of the column, because there is an ancient mosaic map found in Jordan in a church at Medeba. It's called the Mosaic Map of Medeba. Surprise. That map dates to the Emperor Justinian, just about 1,500 years ago. And on that map, it shows the city of Jerusalem, and just inside the Damascus Gate, there is a big column that is shown on the mosaic. Apparently in antiquity, inside this gate, there was a column that delineated the northern entrance to the city. So the Arabs would call it Bab el-Amud, the gate of the column. This is the outside and the outside plaza as it looks today. Again, two more pictures of the outside plaza. There are two towers that flank it, as you can see in the upper left and then in the right-hand picture. And you can see that there are two small projections. These were guard rooms, and they had an opening in the floor. You could either drop hot oil or stones on anybody who was attacking. Just don't fall through the floor itself, or you'd be surrounded by the enemy. From the top of the gate and the wall of the old city of Jerusalem, you can see the lower right-hand picture, and you can look down at that same plaza as it looks today. The road in the background is the Paratroopers Road that runs around the old city, renamed after 1967. The third gate in the northernmost wall of the old city is called Herod's Gate. But in Hebrew, it's called Sha'ar HaParachim, which means the Gate of Flowers, because there are beautifully raised relief carvings of flowers on the exterior surface. It's 755 meters above sea level, slightly lower than that of the New Gate. And it is the northernmost entry into the Muslim quarter, as you can see here on the left. It is flanked by one single tower. Here you can see very closely, if you look at those two round medallions and adjacent to those medallions, you can see that they represent rosettes that have been interpreted as flowers. The Crusaders would build this gate and call it Herod's Gate, named after Herod the Great. And they thought that it was the gate that led outside of the old city to the city house of Herod Antipas, the descendant of King Herod the Great. But today we know archaeologically that this was outside of the city 2,000 years ago and would not have been around during the period of the crucifixion of Jesus. To the northeast, you have Sha'ar HaYarot, the Lion's Gate, but it's also known as St. Stephen's Gate in Christendom, or the Sheep Gate. Here you can see the approach and entrance to the Lion's Gate. And why is it called the Lion's Gate? Anyone want to take a bet? Because when it was seen and when it was executed and created by Suleiman, people looked at it and they thought that these two beautiful images above the gate were two of 4 images of lions. There are 2 on the left and 2 on the right. However, if you talk to any animal enthusiast, he will correct you or she will correct you and scold you and say, those are leopards. Those are not lions. Trust me. When I first got into the academic world and I talked about the Lion's Gate, I was roundly corrected by somebody who knew about animals. And they all came about in a dream. Suleiman's predecessor, Selim I, was threatening to destroy the city of Jerusalem. Now, he had a dream, and in that dream, he said that lions would eat him if he destroyed the holy city. And so he didn't. But then he got a couple of sculptors involved who didn't know a lion from a leopard. This was the gate, though, that was used by the Israeli Armed Forces in 1967, doing an end around from the city of Jerusalem and then attacking and entering it from the backside, which would have been to the east, not the frontal assault the Jordanians were expecting. The only gate along the eastern wall is called the Golden Gate, or the Gate of Mercy. This is what the Christian community would call this gate. And according to Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah would appear through this gate and would appear again when a small M, anointed one, would come to Jerusalem, as recorded in the book of Ezekiel. But you can see that it's all blocked up with a cemetery in front of it. This is the inside of it. Jews used to pray for mercy during the Ottoman Turkish period, and that's why it would be renamed Sha'ar HaRachamim, the Gate of Mercy. It's said that according to Christian sources, Jesus would go through this gate on Palm Sunday. In 1541, the gate, as seen from the inside, would be blocked up. Some people said that it was because of defensive reasons. but others believe that there was a spiritual element involved. Jeremy, you gonna let me go for a few more minutes, please? Okay.
Of course, go on.
Thank you. But apparently, if you're going to have a messianic personality enter into the old city of Jerusalem, then what are you going to do? You're going to block it up to prevent that from happening, as if a brick wall is going to block a messianic anointed individual. But then he got even smarter. His advisors said, you know, the anointed ones, the prophets, the small m mediators in Judaism, would be descendants of Aaron, which meant they were of the priestly class, which meant that you could not enter into a cemetery unless it was a family or your own funeral. Because even though it was sanctified ground, it was unclean ground. So Suleiman would construct a Muslim cemetery to prevent the anointed ones from entering into the city of Jerusalem, just as you see here. 2 gates would remain open on the southern wall today. Shar HaShpot, and this is probably not so much dung as ash and debris from the temple sacrifices that would be carted out the city and then dumped into the Hinnom Valley. But later on, it probably was used also to remove other waste debris into the Hinnom Valley. And this makes perfect sense because the prevailing winds in Jerusalem run from north to south, which means that your pile of ashpot would be downwind and out of your olfactory range within the city. This is the way it looks today. And then finally, to the southwest corner, we have Shar Zion, the Zion Gate. But it's also known in Arabic as Bab Harat al-Yehud, which means the Jewish quarter gate. And that and the Dung Gate were the 2 gates that would lead directly along the perimeter of the Armenian quarter into the Jewish quarter. This is the infamous gate where Jewish occupation in the old city would come to an end after 3,000 years. This would be back in 1948. The Jewish community would be allowed under white flags to leave the old city by the Jordanian Arab Legion and thus end any kind of Jewish presence until June of 1967. It was the site of severe bloodshed and combat during the War of Independence, as you can see on the left. The old city is truly a